Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are pulling back the curtain on a world that is shifting beneath our feet. From Beijing's corridors of power to Washington's latest diplomatic gambit, from the unchecked dangers of artificial intelligence to environmental crises in Hong Kong and racism on the football pitch, these stories are all connected by a single thread: the struggle over who gets to shape the rules of our future.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Tonight is one of those broadcasts where every story we cover feeds into the next. We're going to start in China, where a decade-long experiment in soft power is hitting a wall. Then we'll move to Washington, where President Trump is convening what he's calling a board of peace. We'll examine whether the US and China can find unexpected common ground on AI risks. And we'll close with stories from Hong Kong and European football that remind us these global power struggles have very real consequences for ordinary people.
So buckle in. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and we are not going to sugarcoat any of it. Let's start where the story begins tonight, in Beijing.
That's right. For the past decade, China invested heavily in a network of think tanks staffed by retired high-ranking officials. These weren't dusty academic institutions. They were power brokers, policy incubators, and diplomatic back channels all rolled into one. And according to reporting from the South China Morning Post, that golden age may be coming to an end.
Let's set the scene. Starting around 2013 and 2014, China's leadership actively encouraged the growth of think tanks as instruments of soft power. The idea was straightforward: take retired officials who had deep expertise, extensive networks, and a degree of independence from their active duty counterparts, and give them platforms to engage with the world. These institutes became major players in what's known as Track 2 diplomacy, the unofficial channels where countries hash out sensitive issues away from the cameras and formal negotiating tables.
And it worked, Alex. For years, these think tanks gave China something it desperately needed on the world stage: credible, semi-independent voices who could engage with Western counterparts, attend forums like Davos and the Munich Security Conference, and offer policy recommendations that carried weight precisely because they weren't coming directly from the Communist Party's propaganda apparatus. Former ambassadors, retired military officials, ex-ministers, these were the star players.
But here's where the story turns. According to the South China Morning Post's reporting, at least two significant developments are now threatening this entire ecosystem. The political environment in China has tightened considerably under the current leadership. The room to maneuver, that precious space between government backing and intellectual independence, is shrinking. When you staff a think tank with former officials who still have connections to the party apparatus, those individuals are not truly independent. And as political control tightens, even the appearance of independence becomes harder to maintain.
This is a crucial point. The entire value proposition of these think tanks rested on a delicate balance. They needed government support for funding, access, and legitimacy. But they also needed enough distance from the government to be taken seriously by international partners. The moment foreign diplomats and scholars start viewing these institutes as simply mouthpieces for Beijing, their effectiveness as soft power instruments collapses. And that is exactly what appears to be happening.
And we should be clear about what's at stake here. This isn't just an internal Chinese bureaucratic reshuffling. These think tanks have been playing critical roles in some of the most sensitive diplomatic conversations of the past decade, including discussions around the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait tensions, trade negotiations, and climate policy. If these back channels dry up, the world loses important forums for de-escalation at a time when tensions between major powers are already dangerously high.
The question we need to ask is, who benefits from the decline of these institutions? In the short term, hardliners within China's political establishment benefit, because they face fewer internal voices advocating for engagement and compromise. But in the long term, this is a loss for everyone. When informal diplomatic channels close, misunderstandings become more likely, and misunderstandings between nuclear powers are not something any of us can afford.
It's also worth noting the parallel to what we've seen in other authoritarian systems. Russia went through a similar contraction of its think tank ecosystem in the years before the invasion of Ukraine. Independent voices were sidelined, back channels were severed, and the result was a leadership increasingly insulated from dissenting views and alternative analysis. The lesson of history is clear: when governments silence their own policy experts, bad decisions follow.
And for Western policymakers watching this unfold, the implications are immediate. If your most reliable unofficial contacts in Beijing are being marginalized or silenced, you need new strategies for communication and de-escalation. This isn't a future problem. It's happening right now.
Which brings us directly to our next story, because while China may be closing diplomatic back channels, Washington is attempting to open a new one, though the form it's taking is raising serious questions. Today in Washington, D.C., President Trump is hosting the inaugural meeting of what he's calling the Board of Peace.
Al Jazeera is reporting live from Washington as representatives converge for this first meeting. Now, on its face, the concept of a peace board sounds positive. Who could argue against peace? But as investigative journalists, our job is to look beyond the branding and examine the substance. And when we do that, some significant concerns emerge.
Let's start with the basics. The Board of Peace is being convened by President Trump himself, and it represents his administration's approach to international conflict resolution. The critical questions are, who is at the table, who was left out, what authority does this board actually have, and what conflicts is it intended to address? Because the answers to those questions will tell us whether this is a genuine diplomatic initiative or a political staging exercise.
What we know from Al Jazeera's live coverage is that representatives are converging on Washington for this inaugural session. The framing from the administration has been characteristically grand, positioning this as a historic moment in American diplomacy. But we've seen this playbook before: big announcements, dramatic settings, and then the hard question of whether anything substantive actually follows.
And the timing here is critical. This Board of Peace is being launched at a moment when the United States faces an extraordinarily complex international landscape. You've got the ongoing situation in Ukraine, escalating tensions in the Middle East, the China relationship we just discussed, and numerous other flashpoints. A serious peace initiative would need to engage with all of these. The question is whether this board has the mandate, the staffing, and the genuine diplomatic commitment to do so.
There's also a credibility question that we have to address directly. Peace initiatives derive their legitimacy from the perception that the convening party is an honest broker. The United States under any administration carries baggage in this regard, given its own military engagements and geopolitical interests. But the specific question for this Board of Peace is whether the international community views it as a genuine forum or as an extension of one administration's political agenda.
And let's talk about the diplomatic professionals, the career foreign service officers, the conflict resolution experts, the regional specialists who have spent decades building the relationships and expertise needed for genuine peacemaking. Are they at the center of this initiative, or have they been sidelined in favor of political appointees and loyalists? Because the answer to that question will determine whether this board can actually deliver results.
What concerns me, Alex, is the juxtaposition with our first story. On one hand, we have China potentially closing down its semi-independent diplomatic back channels. On the other, we have the United States creating a new diplomatic structure that may or may not have the institutional depth to be effective. If both of the world's major powers are simultaneously undermining serious, expert-driven diplomacy in favor of politically controlled messaging, we are all in trouble.
That's exactly the pattern we're tracking tonight. The erosion of independent, expert-driven policy voices is not limited to one country or one political system. It's a global trend, and it's dangerous. Which brings us to a story that actually offers a glimmer of hope, though a complicated one.
Our third story tonight also comes from the South China Morning Post, and it's an opinion piece that argues the United States and China can find common ground on something unexpected: the risks posed by artificial intelligence. The author attended the Asia Leaders Series in Zurich, Switzerland, last month, a forum held on the eve of the World Economic Forum meeting, and moderated a session on US-China rivalry.
Now, the author admits to approaching that session with modest expectations. And frankly, who could blame them? US-China strategic competition has been the defining geopolitical story of the past decade, and the relationship has been deteriorating across virtually every dimension: trade, technology, military posture, and diplomatic rhetoric. Finding common ground seems almost naive.
But here's where it gets interesting. The argument is that AI risks represent a unique category of challenge, one where both nations' self-interest aligns in ways that could overcome the broader rivalry. Think about it: an uncontrolled AI arms race threatens both countries. AI-generated disinformation can destabilize any society. Autonomous weapons systems operating without adequate safeguards put everyone at risk. Neither Washington nor Beijing benefits from a world where artificial intelligence spirals beyond human control.
And this isn't purely theoretical. We're already seeing the early consequences of ungoverned AI deployment. Deepfakes are undermining political discourse in both countries. AI-powered surveillance is raising human rights concerns globally. Algorithmic trading systems have triggered flash crashes in financial markets. The risks are real, they're growing, and they don't respect national borders.
The parallel to nuclear arms control is instructive. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an existential rivalry, but they still managed to negotiate arms control agreements because both sides recognized that an uncontrolled nuclear arms race threatened mutual destruction. AI may not present the same kind of immediate existential threat, but the logic of mutual vulnerability applies. Neither country can fully protect itself from the risks of AI deployed irresponsibly by the other.
But here's where I push back on the optimism. Arms control agreements worked, to the extent they did, because both sides had strong institutional frameworks for negotiation, verification, and enforcement. They had experienced diplomats, technical experts, and dedicated agencies. And what have we just spent the first two stories discussing? The erosion of exactly those kinds of institutions. China is sidelining its semi-independent policy experts. The US is experimenting with new diplomatic structures of uncertain quality. The institutional infrastructure needed for AI cooperation may be weakening at exactly the moment it's most needed.
That's a devastating observation, Alex, and it's exactly right. The Zurich Forum and events like it represent the kind of track 2 diplomacy that thrives when both sides maintain credible, semi-independent voices who can explore ideas without committing their governments. If China's think tank ecosystem contracts and the US diplomatic apparatus is reshaped along purely political lines, forums like the Asia Leaders series lose their effectiveness because the people attending them no longer have the independence or influence to translate discussions into policy.
So we're looking at a paradox. The moment when US-China cooperation on AI governance is most urgently needed may coincide with the moment when the institutional capacity for such cooperation is most diminished. That should alarm everyone, regardless of their political orientation.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that this isn't just about the US and China. Europe, which hosted that Zurich Forum, has been trying to position itself as a leader in AI governance through initiatives like the EU AI Act. But European influence depends partly on the major powers being willing to engage. If Washington and Beijing are both turning inward, Europe's ability to broker global AI governance frameworks is severely limited.
Now let's shift gears to a story that might seem disconnected from geopolitics but actually illustrates the same underlying dynamics at a local level. From Hong Kong, the South China Morning Post reports that Greenpeace is calling for long-term measures to address over-tourism in the scenic Sai Kung district after campsites were overwhelmed during Lunar New Year celebrations.
And when I say overwhelmed, I mean dramatically overwhelmed. Greenpeace counted 585 tents at the Ham Tin Wan and Sai Wan campsites. The designated capacity for each site is 50 tents. So Ham Tin Wan alone had 450 tents, that's 9 times its capacity. This isn't a minor overflow. This is an environmental emergency happening in one of Hong Kong's most treasured natural areas.
Let's put this in context. Hong Kong is one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. Its country parks and natural areas aren't just recreational amenities. They're essential ecological infrastructure, providing watershed protection, biodiversity habitat, and air quality benefits for over 7 million residents. When those natural areas are degraded by massive overcrowding, the consequences extend far beyond the inconvenience of a crowded campsite.
And here's what the authorities said: the situation was under control. Let me repeat that. 9 times over capacity, and the official response is that it's under control. This is the kind of institutional language that should set off alarm bells for any journalist. When authorities describe an obvious crisis as manageable, it usually means they either lack the tools to address it or lack the political will.
Greenpeace is calling for long-term measures, and that's the key phrase here, long-term. This isn't a one-off incident. Over-tourism in Hong Kong's natural areas has been building for years, driven by a combination of factors including social media promotion of scenic locations, limited recreational options in the urban core, and insufficient investment in park management infrastructure.
And this connects to a global pattern we see from Barcelona to Bali to the Galapagos. When governments fail to invest in sustainable management of natural and cultural assets, those assets get loved to death. The solution isn't to ban people from enjoying nature. It's to invest in reservation systems, carrying capacity management, alternative site development, and enforcement of environmental regulations. But all of that requires sustained political commitment and funding.
What strikes me about this story, Maya, is how it mirrors the institutional failures we've been discussing in our geopolitical coverage tonight. In each case, short-term political considerations are overriding long-term institutional needs. China's think tanks are being constrained for political control. The US is experimenting with politically driven diplomacy. And Hong Kong's natural areas are being sacrificed because implementing effective management would require political courage and investment that authorities seem unwilling to provide.
You're seeing it too, then. The common thread across all of tonight's stories is the failure of institutions to protect long-term public goods against short-term political pressures. Whether the public good is diplomatic stability, AI governance, or environmental preservation, the dynamic is the same.
Let's move to our final story of the evening, and it's one that brings this theme into sharp personal focus. Liverpool manager Arne Slot has spoken out in support of Real Madrid's Vinicius Jr., saying that football must do more against racism. Al Jazeera reports that Slot is adding his voice to growing calls for systemic action in the sport.
This is a story that's been building for years. Vinicius Jr., one of the most talented footballers on the planet, has been subjected to repeated racist abuse, particularly in Spanish football. He's been targeted with monkey chants from stadium crowds, received racist messages on social media, and faced discriminatory behavior that would be unthinkable in any professional workplace. And yet the institutional response from football's governing bodies has been, at best, inconsistent and inadequate.
When Arne Slot says football must do more, he's making an understatement of extraordinary proportions. Football's governing bodies, from FIFA down to national federations, have vast resources, enormous influence, and clear rules against racist behavior. What they have consistently lacked is the will to enforce those rules with meaningful consequences. Fines that amount to pocket change for wealthy clubs, stadium closures that are rarely imposed, and bans that are easily circumvented do not constitute serious action.
And let's be clear about the economics here. Football is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. Broadcasters pay enormous sums for rights. Sponsors invest hundreds of millions in partnerships with clubs and leagues. These commercial stakeholders have tremendous leverage, and they have largely failed to use it. When a sponsor threatens to pull funding over racist incidents, leagues and federations suddenly find the capacity to act. The fact that they don't act without that pressure tells you everything about institutional priorities.
This is where the story connects to our broader theme tonight. Football's institutions, like the diplomatic institutions and environmental agencies we've discussed, are failing to protect a fundamental public good, in this case, the basic dignity and safety of players. And they're failing for the same reason: short-term commercial and political considerations are being prioritized over long-term institutional integrity.
What makes Slot's intervention significant is that he's a high-profile figure with a platform, and he's choosing to use it. That matters because institutional change in football, like institutional change in any sphere, requires pressure from within. When managers, players, and coaches consistently speak out, it becomes harder for governing bodies to maintain the status quo. But individual voices, no matter how prominent, cannot substitute for systemic reform.
Vinicius himself has been remarkably courageous in this fight, refusing to be silenced and using his platform to demand accountability. But it's deeply troubling that the burden of combating racism is falling primarily on its victims. The institutions that govern football should be leading this fight, not being dragged into it reluctantly by the players who are being abused.
And the racial abuse in football isn't happening in a vacuum. It reflects broader societal currents, the rise of nationalist and nativist movements across Europe, the normalization of dehumanizing rhetoric in public discourse, and the failure of social media platforms to meaningfully address online hate. When we talk about football needing to do more, we're really talking about society needing to do more.
So let's pull this all together, Maya, because tonight's stories form a pattern that I think our audience needs to see clearly.
The pattern is this: across every story we've covered tonight, we see institutions that were designed to protect long-term public goods being undermined by short-term political and commercial pressures. China's think tanks, built to advance diplomacy and policy expertise, are being constrained by political control. The U.S. Board of Peace, whatever its intentions, is being launched in an environment where diplomatic expertise is undervalued. AI governance, which requires unprecedented international cooperation, is being stymied by the same great power competition it's meant to address.
Hong Kong's natural treasures are being degraded because authorities won't invest in sustainable management. Football's anti-racism frameworks remain toothless because commercial interests outweigh moral imperatives. In every case, the pattern is the same: we have the knowledge, the resources, and the institutional frameworks to address these challenges. What we lack is the political will to prioritize long-term public welfare over short-term convenience.
And here's what makes this moment particularly dangerous: these institutional failures are compounding. When diplomatic back channels close, it becomes harder to cooperate on AI governance. When AI governance fails, disinformation accelerates, which further erodes the political environments in which institutions operate. When environmental protections weaken, public trust in government declines, which makes it harder to build support for any institutional reform. It's a vicious cycle, and we are watching it accelerate in real time.
The question for our audience tonight is not whether these problems are solvable. They absolutely are. The question is whether we, collectively, are willing to demand that our institutions be held to account. Whether we're willing to insist that diplomatic expertise matters more than political loyalty. That environmental protection matters more than bureaucratic convenience. That human dignity matters more than commercial revenue.
Because the alternative is a world where every institution we depend on, for peace, for safety, for environmental protection, for basic human decency, continues to hollow out from the inside. And if that sounds alarmist, look at the stories we've covered tonight and tell me the trendline points in any other direction.
The South China Morning Post, Al Jazeera, and the analysts and advocates we've drawn on tonight are doing vital work documenting these trends. But documentation alone isn't enough. These are stories that demand action, from policymakers, from corporate leaders, from sporting bodies, and from citizens who refuse to accept institutional decay as inevitable.
That's exactly right. The golden age of Chinese think tanks didn't end by accident. The inadequacy of football's response to racism isn't a mystery. The overcrowding of Hong Kong's campsites isn't a surprise. These are all the predictable consequences of institutional neglect, and they will only get worse until we demand better.
So that's our report for tonight. We are Alex Truth and Maya Clarity, and this has been Truth Report. We don't just report the news. We follow the power, we follow the money, and we follow the institutional failures that the powerful would rather you didn't notice.
Stay informed, stay critical, and most importantly, stay engaged. Because the institutions that are supposed to serve us will only do so if we hold them to it. Good night, everyone.
Good night. And remember, the truth doesn't report itself. See you next time.